Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Dennis Freeman. Today we're talking about the 2002 collection, Everything's Eventual, and this includes 11 short stories and 3 novellas. So I know you said this is one of your favorite collections, if not your favorite. So how are you doing, Dennis? Are you ready to talk about one of your favorite collections here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This has been, I remember when this came out, my mom actually let me skip school and we went and got a copy of this. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and before we dive into discussing some of the bigger stories here, it's one of those things where, we probably won't get to everything, so I just want to quickly list out all of the stories and where they were originally published. So first up, we have Autopsy Room 4 from 6 stories, The Man in the Black Suit from an issue of The New Yorker, All That You Love Will Be Carried Away, also from an issue of The New Yorker, The Death of Jack Hamilton, again, issue of The New Yorker. Clearly, The New Yorker really likes Stephen King. In the Death Room, which was a Blood and Smoke audiobook, The Little Sisters of Eluria, which was published in Legends, Everything's Eventual, obviously the title story, was published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, LT's Theory of Pets, another one from 6 stories, The Road Virus Heads North, which was from 999, not sure what that is, but I'm sure it's some sort of publication. Lunch at the Gotham Cafe, published in Dark Love, That Feeling You Can Only Say What It Is in French, from The New Yorker, 1408, also a Blood and Smoke audiobook. Writing the Bullet is actually an ebook that he released and included it in this collection. Lucky Quarter from an issue of USA Weekend. So there's a lot here, and because I mentioned, a few of them are novellas, you get a sense that it's a good mix of things for him as far as a collection goes.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's long for a short story collection. I get,
Yeah.
I think, what is there, three novellas in there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think my copy was somewhere around 570 pages or something, so it's definitely a lengthy read, and we should go ahead and just talk a little bit about Autopsy Room 4, because this one was eventually adapted into an episode of the Nightmares and Dreamscapes TV series that aired in 2006. So I haven't watched it just yet, but I always want to try to talk about the ones that end up becoming adaptations, and obviously more of these could become adaptations down the line because nothing's off limits when it comes to Stephen King, but Autopsy Room 4 is a real attention grabber, so it's perfect as the first story in this collection.
Definitely. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was, what was his name? I think it was Stephen First, the guy who played Old Bill in the original It series, ended up actually playing the main character on the table on that one when it was released. The short story is actually pretty good. It's not one of my favorites, but it's definitely scary.
Yeah, and you get the feeling that he was trying to mislead you because at first you think there truly is a dead body and you're kind of trying to figure out what's going on. And then when there's the twist, oh, oops, he's not dead, but we almost, did the autopsy on him. You're just like, oh my goodness,
yeah.
That is a literal nightmare to think about.
Yeah. See, and that's kind of what when I was, like you were saying, when I first read it, that for me was like, okay, is this what happens when we die? Is that the scary part? Like, do we just know and don't go? But no, when they found out, when they actually found out he was alive, I was more relieved than anything.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's so close to becoming a complete disaster that when you find this out, you're like, oh, okay, maybe we're good here.
One of the things about it, the Peruvian boom slang that he was talking about. I remember after I had read it, I kind of done some research, and it turns out that the snake he was there are boom slangs, but he completely made up the snake in that thing. So there was for months I was terrified of a fake snake.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say where I live now has a ton of snakes. I've only really seen one, and it was dead. So it was like a bird had dropped it or something, and it still startled me, but I was like, oh no, after reading this, I was like, I don't want to come into contact or be near anything that could cause anything like this. So good to know it's fake.
Oh yeah, I live in the American South, and there's copperheads, black snakes, and all kinds of fun ones in the water too. So I'm not a fan of snakes to begin with.
What did you think of the whole prepping for the autopsy scene? Because I felt like he wrote it so well that you could literally visualize the character's every move.
Oh yeah, and it definitely was one of those things where you can tell that he researched. Like, it seriously felt like he had went through the trouble of actually looking this stuff up. So I was pretty happy about it. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, I was thrilled when I read this first story, and it just completely grabbed my attention because I haven't been super fond of the short story collections in particular. I don't know if it's just because there's so many packed into these collections that I don't really have a ton of time to sit with each one because I'm literally reading them as if they were chapters of an entire book. And, I think something like
Yeah.
different seasons, because you get to spend a little more time with those being novellas, you get to have those sink in by the time you're done with the book because there's only 4, whereas most of his collections seem to have at least 10 stories. Some have way more if there are no novellas in them. So it's just so much to take in at once. But with this one, I felt like it was a very, very solid collection. I didn't really find myself bored with too many of these. And you have a couple that actually play into the Dark Tower. You have the Little Sisters of Illyria, and apparently everything's Eventual ties into it as well. And
Oh yeah, that one was. Oh man, that tie-in was so exciting when I first read that. I was so shocked.
yeah, the way he ties in the Dark Tower sometimes is just so amazing because there are certain tie-ins that aren't super obvious, but then when you have something like the Little Sisters of Illyria, it's like, oh, okay, here's Roland. We know it ties in.
Yeah, right. That was the second you see, like, we're talking about the gunslinger, you're like, oh, here we are. Let's do it.
Yeah, and I like that this just gave you another glimpse into something Roland had been through, and you really start to get a better feel for the character with some of these tie-ins. And you have books like The Eyes of the Dragon that aren't quote unquote Dark Tower novels, but they still tie in an interesting way.
Oh yeah, they all touch, at the very least.
But it was nice to get a story about Roland right before I'm going to go into books 5, 6, and 7 back to back to back, because that's how he released them after his accident. He realized, oh, I have to finish up this story in case anything happens to me, since he seems to be a guy who has quite a bit of bad luck at times.
God, yeah, that, man, I remember my mom when that happened. She was a huge Stephen King addict, and when she heard that he got hit, she was beside herself. And then after she had calmed down, she realized that she wasn't going to get to read the rest of the Dark Tower. Man, that would have been, things would have been a whole lot different if we'd have lost Stephen King back then.
Absolutely. This podcast would pretty much be over with this book, I imagine. Aside from
probably
adaptations, of course. But as far as the novels and collections go, what did you think of the sisters and the fact that they turn out to be vampires? It felt like he really wanted to mesh his fantasy world with his horror world, and I think it worked pretty well.
Honestly, that was interesting enough. The sisters themselves were kind of cool. Definitely shocked me when I found out exactly what they were. It was the doctor bugs that really, it got me, because I don't know what it is about the mental image that painted, but it reminded me of the Langoliers almost. I don't know why, but it was that's what in my head, like little tiny Langoliers.
I can imagine how that visual would stick with you.
Yeah, right?
What did you think of the title story then? Because the fact that both of these were back to back, I think, sort of just gives you a nice chunk of the Dark Tower all in one go.
Yeah, I've said, actually, I said on this podcast before that Stephen King's short stories are a lot of what made me become a writer, and Everything's Eventual is what made me actually start publishing the stories. It is, Dinky Earnshaw is kind of that everyman character. He's, the pizza delivery guy or whatever, and he just has something innate in his mind that just makes him something when everybody else thinks he's nothing. I don't know. Regardless of how he used that ability, I thought that the story itself was a pretty cool underdog story.
It really was, and I didn't entirely catch on to the Dark Tower connection at first. I was like, oh, this is kind of an odd story.
Yeah. And what was actually funny is some of the names that, I guess, how they say Ka is a wheel. You got Dinky Earnshaw, who this particular character actually shows up in the Dark Tower. But Skipper Brannigan, I believe is the kid's name, from the story. He is actually also a dickhead friend of Eddie Dean.
Right.
Way back in the day in Co-op City. But, so some of the names keep popping up, even though they're not the exact same characters. But then you have Dinky Earnshaw, who is the same character. So it kind of plays to the timelines that Stephen King really goes for with the Dark Tower.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, Dinky is a breaker, kind of like Ted from Low Men in Yellow Coats. So that's sort of how you get that connection there.
Oh, yeah. And the whole idea of Breaker aside, because I know we're working on Everything's Eventual, not the Dark Tower, but the whole idea of sidekicks being used for assassinations, and the fact that he actually thinks he's doing a good thing until he starts reading the paper. Like, that to me, man, that would just be, could you imagine just the psychological damage that would really be, like, when you start realizing I'm being used to assassinate political rivals and teachers and things like that.
Yeah, it's wild, the things he comes up with. Sometimes you're like, oh, okay, he kind of wants us to like certain characters, but they tend to do things that are very unlikable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and Stephen King making you like unlikable characters is part of the reason I think people still read. It's enjoyable. I know a lot of his stories, you just, anti-heroes. Roland is a terrible, terrible, terrible hero.
Right.
But he makes a hell of an anti-hero.
Exactly. Well, I think we can move on to 1408 real quick here, because I love a good haunted house, haunted hotel, haunted whatever story.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It's every horror writer's, we all owe one to the horror gods, and I think Stephen King nailed it.
Yeah, so you have Mike Enslin, who is a writer of nonfiction, and he writes about haunted places, which, again, this kind of feels like what they did with Haunting of Hill House, because if I'm not mistaken, wasn't one of the characters in that a writer and would write about sort of these ghostly paranormal experiences?
I want to say yes. I think maybe they were a journalist. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, I believe you're right.
Yeah, so that kind of reminded me of that. And then you have the guy who is showing Enslin his room, and he has these stories and makes him have a drink with him. And I really thought that just the way that character acted, and I'm totally spacing on his name, Mr. Olin. There we go.
Yeah.
And it really just felt like there was something about the room, and he didn't want to talk about it, but he wanted to talk to the guy. And, you get all of these facts, like there have been 42 deaths, 12 of them were suicides over a span of 68 years. And they're throwing these numbers at you. And if you take a second and think, you're like, wow, that's a lot. That's not just chance. There are always going to be things that happen at hotels unexpectedly, or, tragedies just happen. And to have this room be that haunted and have that much bad luck, it's like, why didn't you stop letting people stay in that room after like 2?
See, and that's kind of like what was interesting about that is, I think, what was it, 13 suicides? He's like, about the 13 suicides, but what about the natural death? And of course, Enslin said, his inner monologue hadn't thought about it. And to be honest, neither had I. Like, 13 suicides. Yeah, that's pretty terrible, but it's a big city that Dolphin has been in, for years and years and years. So I guess there's probably been suicides in other rooms. But when he starts talking about the natural deaths, and not any of them are very pleasant. So it just, that part to me was where you kind of realized Olin wasn't trying to feed him a story. Olin was trying to save him. He was trying to make sure he didn't die.
Yeah, I really just liked how this one progressed and played out. I believe it's one of the longer short stories, if I'm not mistaken, too.
I don't remember which one is the longest, but 1408, it feels even longer if you listen to the audiobook, because Stephen King is a great writer, but as a narrator, he kind of has a lot to be desired.
Yeah, there's also the fun fact that all of the numbers in the title add up to the unlucky number 13.
Of course.
Yeah, and Writing the Bullet is one of the novellas because this was written as an ebook, and we've seen Stephen King sort of experiment with formats. I semi-recently read The Plant, and the way he released that, the style of the book, the format of the book was totally different from anything he had ever done. So he was really trying to embrace this sort of new technology that was coming out at the time, and ebooks weren't super big in 2000, I would say. I could be wrong about that, but it seems like it's something that's becoming a little bigger now that more people have embraced the digital age.
Well, see, back then, most people didn't think it was going to take off at all. Like, he wrote that one, was it for Kindle? Nobody thought that ebooks were going to replace, I mean, they may never replace, but they are definitely a great supplement.
Yeah, and in the first 24 hours of this story being released as an ebook, over 400,000 copies were downloaded. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the price point was $2.50 as well. That's not super pricey for a novella. Yeah. And when you are so used to paying, $30 for a hardcover or something, maybe not back then, let's call it $20 or something, but that price point, you're going to entice at least some people who are willing to read the ebook wherever they chose to. And, I don't even know what the status of tablets like the Kindle were at that time, but I imagine it was definitely a risk for him.
Definitely. And the Kindle wasn't the one I had back then was the one that had its own internet. Not a very good one, mind you, but you could, download your own book and stuff, and you could buy it online or on their little store. It was very bare bones, but that whole era was kind of interesting. And then when, Writing the Bullet came out, I got to be honest, I wasn't 100% sold on it, but I checked it out when it first came out, and it was pretty cool. I love it's a great story in general.
I love that it takes you back to Lewiston too, because we've seen so many real and fictional cities within Maine, and sometimes King just quickly revisits certain places, and you instantly know that you're in this Stephen King universe.
Yep. The second you hear that, Lewiston, Castle Rock, Derry, the second you hear any of those, you're like, I know what we're doing.
And he perfectly wrote the creepy old man character.
That's another thing. I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen with that old dude. I thought the old man, I guess it's what we call a dual citizen. It's kind of like, like if he'd just stayed in that truck with that old man, regardless of how he smelled or how he acted, everything could have been avoided.
Yeah, it was just one of those things where this guy is being so creepy, so you have Alan, who is kind of worried, for his own safety, reasonably, and he gets in a car with a person who is even more dangerous.
Yep. That got me. That, God, what was that guy's name? George? It was George Staub, I think. Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah, it was definitely one of those things that felt like a roller coaster ride in book form.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's necessarily like a horror trope, the get in the car with the dead guy. I'm sure there are plenty of wives' tales and old folklores, but that to me, the fact that as he kind of went on, he kind of started to realize that something wasn't right, and actually kind of reminded me of Belch Huggins from the It book.
Yeah, definitely get that vibe. So this is one that, like 1408, was adapted into a movie. So you have these two sort of bigger production movies, and then you have Autopsy Room 4 that becomes a TV episode, so maybe not as big of a budget there. But it's always interesting to me which stories are adapted, and I have not seen any of the adaptations, so I can't speak to the quality of them, but I know they definitely got some big names for the two movies at least.
I mean, in this particular one, I can't remember. I know David Arquette was in it, which, unless it's a Scream movie, I don't necessarily think it's big budget horror. But it also had Jonathan Jackson in it, who, I mean, he's done a lot of ABC soap operas and stuff, but he's definitely talented. But I didn't actually, man, it's been so many years since I've seen the film.
It's a Mick Garris production, and he directed it. So he is someone who has been very ingrained in Stephen King's world just because he has done so many things. And it looks like this one actually wasn't a super big production. And then Cliff Robertson was in it. So he played Uncle Ben in the Spider-Man trilogy. That's sort of the thing I know him from. But it did not do well at the box office. It made $134,000 and change.
Stephen King adaptations. I mean, what do you? He's happy to cash the royalty checks, but man, he needs to be more selective sometimes.
Yeah, and you have fun little tidbits. It looks like Matt Frewer returns. He's been in a few of the Mick Garris things, and I think some of the Mick Garris stuff is hit or miss for me, so it'll be interesting to see how I feel about that one. So really, it's 1408 that probably had the bigger budget, I would say. I mean, it has John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson, so you know they got paid.
Oh yeah, John Cusack. Yeah. Yeah, Cusack killed it as Ensign, and I mean, you couldn't do better for an Olin than Samuel L. Jackson in a Stephen King film is like it's like Samuel L. Jackson in a Quentin Tarantino film. Like, it just makes sense, and it's amazing every single time. He does not miss.
Yeah, there's actually one more story I want to touch on, and it's The Road Virus Heads North, because this one was just so fascinating. He took this idea of a painting and did an entire story around a painting that is based on one he actually had that his family did not like. And I love sometimes how he just takes these things from his real life and then adds this twist to it that just gives it that extra push and makes it way more interesting.
That one was weird to me.
Oh, and excuse me, this one actually is also an episode of Nightmare and Dreamscapes.
Yeah, it is. I had actually forgotten about that. I don't want to say I wasn't a fan of it.
Okay.
It wasn't one of my favorite stories, but it was super cool. Like, the idea of basically racing this thing, like, man, it was creepy.
Yeah, it gave you that feeling of, oh God, what's going to happen?
Yeah, he had stopped, what was it, at his aunt's house?
Yeah.
Yeah, he had stopped at his aunt's, yeah. And he kind of, didn't really think anything of it, but then, like, it kind of Dorian Gray meets the crazy cop from Desperation.
Yeah. And a couple other stories from this have been used as dollar babies. So there are some other adaptations out there from this collection, but they're probably going to be relatively hard to find. Like Lunch at the Gotham Cafe was adapted into a short film called Gotham Cafe in 2005. It has some names attached to it. Stephen King makes a cameo. Mick Garris is in it. and it was co-produced by Steve Wozniak, who is the Apple co-founder, and it's just sort of
Oh wow.
bizarre
Yeah.
how some of these things play out. And, I might have to do some extra homework here and find more of these. But Dennis, is there any story in particular we didn't touch on that you want to discuss?
None that we didn't already touch on. Like 1408, I honestly someday I really want to see a just a full on breakdown of that book and movie. That one is probably one of my all time favorite. Like I was saying before, it's just like every writer owes the horror gods at least a haunted house or a haunted hotel story, and that for me was just terrifying. Like the phone calls in the room to when he finally set himself on fire to get out. That was probably one of my favorite stories in general. Not just King, but just overall.
I also really love the extra information he gave with each story, kind of describing the inspiration for it.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. It's funny because you always kind of wonder, he always kind of jokes about how people ask, where do you get your ideas? And when he openly shares it like that, it's hard not to just be in wonder of the dude sometimes.
And obviously, he loves sharing how he comes up with ideas because he wrote On Writing. He has some other books or essays that talk about the craft of writing. So he's someone who is definitely willing to share. And I think because, at least from what I can tell, given how many quotes he has on other people's books, like the press quotes and pull quotes and whatnot, but it feels like he just loves reading and writing so much, and he wants to help inspire other people to do the same. So I love when anything like that is included in the books, even if it's just, a few of them were a paragraph maybe.
Yeah, and that was always just anything the man has to say. I mean, he's been publishing since the 70s, and it's hard not to take everything the man says as gospel. He is, I don't want to say, man, I honestly think he's one of those guys we're going to be studying, 50 years from now. Like, he's, long after he's dead, he's going to be part of the culture, not just in horror, but in writing in general.
Yeah, I think a lot of what he has done has helped make the genre more accepted as well, kind of in the mainstream, because you don't have too many horror authors, to my knowledge, that have sold at the scale that Stephen King has.
No. And not while they were alive. That's for sure.
Yeah, most can't do that kind of output either. Most normal people, anyway.
No. Yeah, he is a freak of nature. That's a whole nother. You got to kind of wonder how. I mean, he's dedicated and he treats it like a job.
I wonder that every day I do this podcast. How?
Right? It's like, I mean, you look at it, it's like, how do you write that much so fast? And it's because it's what he does. And I think, honestly, I know he says he doesn't do it for the money, but I tend to believe him. I don't think anybody writes that much for a paycheck. I think if he doesn't, the day he stops writing is the day we're all going to have to say goodbye to him.
Yeah, and I'm with you on the whole money thing, because if he was doing it for the money and because he wanted to be in Hollywood, he wouldn't still be living in, Maine and Florida.
Exactly, man. God, that's the Mecca. I got to get out there one time. We got to do a photo shoot out that way.
I know he probably spends, well, I don't know this, but I'm willing to bet he spends a little more time in Florida. Maybe not right now, but it is warmer there. Yes, we are recording this during the COVID pandemic in 2020 for anyone listening far off in the future.
Good luck, everybody else.
Yeah, well, is there anything else you want to touch on with this collection, Dennis?
No, ma'am. We covered it, and I really appreciate you having me on here. This is getting to sit and riff about Stephen King is probably one of the best uses of my time since the pandemic started.
Yeah, it's always hard for me because I'm going through these so quickly. I'm like, okay, here comes a collection. I know I'm not going to talk about it super in depth, but lately I've been sort of brainstorming ideas for what happens to this podcast once I get caught up, and it might not necessarily have enough content to come out weekly just from, the books and adaptations. Because like you said, at some point, probably the day he dies is going to be the day he stops writing. And if something's unfinished, who knows? Maybe Joe or Owen will finish it up and it'll still get released. But, once I catch up, which is still over a year off, but, once it's to the point where, he releases 1 or 2 books a year and maybe there's 2 or 3 adaptations a year, I clearly won't have weekly content. So I'm kind of like, okay, do I just do episodes as things come out, or do I brainstorm all of these ideas, maybe revisit certain stories that I want to go more in depth on? There's so many options. There's so much Stephen King stuff out there.
Oh yeah. Some of it, like the Dollar Babies, any of that is just, you could probably work 20 years on just everything to do with Stephen King if you really, really wanted to.
There are some short films that I do want to try to seek out. I just didn't for the purpose of, this being a weekly thing. And I didn't want to do stuff that guests would have a ton of trouble finding. So maybe I will, find Frank Darabont's short that he did before Shawshank and the Green Mile or something like that.
Definitely. Man, anything you do, I'm going to be downloading it. I'm going to be downloading your podcast no matter what. So it's always on the iPhone.
I appreciate that. And Dennis, I'm sure you will be back on for a future episode. There are still a few more collections to my knowledge. So thank you for coming on to talk about everything's Eventual today.
Yes, ma'am. Anytime. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Of course. Anything you want to plug real quick before we go?
Ooh, you mean, okay, yeah. Let me go ahead and toot my own horn. No, but I actually have my newest short story, Fang Bangers, A Tale from the Terrorverse, is going to be releasing on Audible very soon. So if you're familiar with the Terrorverse, just look me up on Audible, Dennis Freeman, and you'll find Slasher Survival School, Fang Bangers, and Brothers Last Call. I am all over it. So I'm also on Amazon. So hit me up on any of the social media too.
Awesome. And there will be links to all of those in the show notes for you guys. So Dennis, thank you again.
Thank you. Stay scared.
All right. That does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.